Good evening, everyone, or morning, or wherever you are when you're watching this. I'm Asha Nayaswami, and we're continuing with our class on Swami's wonderful book in Divine Friendship, Letters of Counsel and Reflection. So let's start this evening with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, Friend, Beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, Beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, Saints of all religions, humbly we bow to you all. Lift our spirits that we may feel your presence within our hearts. We are living in this world by thy will alone. Guide us that all our decisions and our thoughts and our responses to life may be inspired by our attunement with you. Show us the way to be instruments of your love, that we may share with others the many blessings you have showered upon us. We are your children. Guide us and bless us. Om. Peace. Amen. Let's just have a couple of minutes of silence. Om. Peace. Amen. Okay. Let's go and see what we can find tonight. So, this letter, we're still in the section called Advice and Encouragement. We might get through it tonight, but we'll see. And the summary for this letter is called Be Only a Fellow Seeker. It's written in the mid-1990s. Swami says, and I know nothing about the backstory for this letter, don't seek to be a teacher, but seek rather to help people spiritually, with a sense of sharing with them. You write that they haven't been listening to you. That is because you haven't manifested the magnetism to attract them to what you say. In trying to be a teacher, you've awakened the thought in their minds, who are you to tell me? Instead, serve people humbly and according to what you perceive to be their present needs and understanding. I myself have, if you like, been a teacher for over 45 years. Never in all this time have I thought of myself as teaching anyone. I've always seen myself as a fellow seeker, blessed in turn when anyone accepts whatever I've felt guided to say. And then he says, may I suggest you get the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. Wait a second. Explained. It's a great work and explains many of the dilemmas you are facing. I will pray for you. This is a very interesting concept. Swami himself said when he was asked, probably came up in the context of the depositions, but it comes up in interviews at various times. Many times people will say, well, I'm a spiritual teacher or something like that. I myself, when I have to give the simplest answer to a stranger as to what I do, well, actually now I say I'm a writer, because after 4 books I feel I have a right to say that. But before that, when people asked me what I would do, I would say I was a meditation teacher, because it was sort of close enough to the truth, and enough of the truth that it brought me into a world where if they wanted to know more, I could answer the questions from that. But other than that, I've scrupulously followed what Swami said. And I never say that I'm a spiritual teacher. And quite apart from what you say, it's a very important thing not to have that self-definition, because it is, first of all, it's a dangerous self-definition. This is what I was starting to say. Swamiji says, I myself, if you like, could be called a teacher, and he has been for decades. But he says he never calls himself that. When people ask him, what do you do? He never says, I'm a spiritual teacher. He never says, I'm a teacher. Because that immediately puts you in a relationship with people where they don't know and you know, and you're going to teach them. And Swami also has said in he didn't put it here, but in other context where he's expressed, where his self-definition is not a teacher and he never speaks of it that way. He said it's too sensitive. It's too sensitive for a person to risk that idea within themselves, because it can just lead to so many other attitudes. I don't think Swamiji is vulnerable to any of those attitudes. In fact, when he said something to Master about not wanting to have to stand in front of people and lecture because he didn't want to fall into ego, Master said to him with great force, "You will never fall due to ego." So it isn't that Swami himself was actually vulnerable. But it's a bad way to think. And the better is that you're here to share. You know, you have something that you're enthusiastic about and you want to tell people about it. And the way Swami puts it, and it's very important, he feels blessed if people listen to him. When you think of yourself as a teacher, we immediately, you think of elementary school and so on, where everybody has to listen to you. And when you start thinking of yourself as a teacher, then you start feeling annoyed if they don't listen to. It's not appropriate that they're not listening to me. They should respect me. They should listen to me. After all, I'm the teacher here. But really, first of all, and I love the way Swami puts this here, whoever this is, and I had experience with someone in a similar context, but it was similar but not quite the same. He's saying here, you're thinking of yourself as a teacher, and you haven't earned, let me phrase it differently. It's not other people who are looking to you as a teacher. It's not like they see you as a teacher. You have presented yourself as their teacher. And so that, he said, gets the response from them, which is, "Who are you to teach me?" See, with Swamiji, in all the early years, and really until the very end, but especially in the early years, he never put himself forth he never put himself forth as fundamentally requiring any kind of allegiance from us. If we perceived him as someone we wanted to listen to, if we perceived him intuitively as somebody who we felt even reverence and respect for, he would accept it because it was what we actually felt. It wasn't because I am the teacher and this is how you teach, this is how you should treat me. And we didn't have a culture at Ananda for a long time, which was wonderful, I say, where it was, this is Swami Kriyananda and this is how you're supposed to treat him. So everything happened as a spontaneous result of magnetism. So what he's expressing to this person, this man or this woman, is you've come in thinking of yourself as a teacher, and even whether you're announcing it or not, you're putting yourself forward as a person somebody ought to listen to. But then Swami says, and it's completely telling, but you haven't generated the magnetism that makes them seek out your counsel. So as a result, you're asserting something that nobody feels. You're just trying to persuade them that they ought to. And in fact, what they do, and quite naturally, is they resent it. I was in a position, and it wasn't quite the same because it was a question of skill and contribution, but when we were in the process of publishing The Path, which was the year 1977, the summer of 77, Swami was in India. He left the country for several months. And it was in the hands of a group of us to get that book published, and I was more or less the coordinator of that effort. And there was one person in the group who was actually very talented, was an excellent proofreader, had a very good artistic eye, and very good, was highly educated in English and in writing. But their manner of presenting their ideas was not magnetic and did not attract people to listen. And they wanted to be in a position where they got to be the final funnel through which everything went before it was approved, and they wanted to have influence over every aspect of it. And I was in charge, and therefore they appealed to me to set things up that way. I spoke in somewhat of a jocular manner, but I actually meant it. I said, it doesn't matter what I set up. I could mandate any system you want. If people don't feel that your input is beneficial, then they will find a way to go around you, I absolutely promise you. What you have to do is you have to make your input helpful to people. If your input is helpful, if they see that you're able to catch mistakes that they've made, if you can present your ideas in such a way that you can win them to the idea that this is a better way to do that, then people will seek you out because they know that you are going to help them accomplish what they're trying to accomplish. But if you merely put yourself as this barrier between them and the completion of their work, I know the folk here. They just won't do it. My authority is not sufficient, and neither is yours. So he's also making the same point. If you have to make yourself useful to people, you can't tell them that you have something useful to give them. You have to actually give them something useful. And part of the way that you do that, as Swami's saying, is that you're humble. And you actually genuinely think, how can I serve you? Not, how can I make a position with you, but what can I do to help you? How can I help you? And if your thought is, how can I help? Then that creates the magnetism for people to listen. So it's a very, very important thing to keep in mind, because I hear people come to me. In fact, it's somewhat in the next one. People will go to a psychic or a palm reader or a tarot card reader or even an astrologer, and they'll be told that their destiny is to be a teacher. And then they'll come to me and they'll tell me they're supposed to be teachers. And I just go, whoa, don't talk like that. Don't think like that. It's just not helpful. If you have to, use oblique words. I give classes, I give lectures. I talk about myself, that I was in a very privileged position to receive an enormous amount of instruction from Swami Kriyananda. I was able to learn a great deal from him. And I'm in the very wonderful position of passing on to other people as much as I can what I learned from him. I mean, that's really how I feel about myself, because it's not wise to think of myself in any other way. It's also not true. It's not I who am doing anything, except I had extraordinary opportunity, and I have a good memory for what I learned. I have a way with words, and I have a good memory. So as a consequence, I get to talk all the time about the things that are most important to me to people who choose to hear it. But nobody has an obligation. And if people disregard me or treat me with whatever they want to treat me with, that's their perfect right to do so. It's you're being on the safe side of things. And also people are more inclined to listen to you if you're not always telling them that they ought to. It's sort of like if you have to tell people that they ought to listen to you, you've already lost. Swamiji himself was so delicate with it. I remember once he said, he was referring to a 6-year-old boy. He said, I did live with Master, he said, and none of the rest of you did. And I have been on the path for 30 years, and most of you just arrived yesterday. So there is a good chance that I know more than little Stevie knows. He said, but still, if you don't think so, there's no actual learning that's possible unless the respect is inherent and magnetic. So very important. And also important, Ananda is really interesting in that respect because position does not necessarily, position does not define magnetism, and position does not define spiritual progress. Position is simply responsibility. You have a position, you become responsible for something, and it's necessary for you to act that out, and one hopes to act out one's responsibility with magnetism. But even Swami himself has arranged Ananda in a very decentralized manner. And even though we have a designated successor who is Jyotish, and designated world leaders, Jyotish and Devi, together, and it is quite appropriate and spontaneous that the both of them receive an enormous amount of respect and regard, all of which it is totally warranted. It's not mandated. It's magnetized. And in fact, when Swamiji was appointing Jyotish's successor, he said quite simply, he says, there is one among us that everyone sees in that light. He said, without, as Swami said, without the necessity for me to assert it. It just simply is there. And Jyotish and Devi have won the respect that people give them. They haven't demanded it. And from that, as Swami said, it's necessary to have a specific individual designated as the world leader, because he said that person will exemplify, or persons, will exemplify Ananda's ideals. I know that I've said this in other contexts, but it's worth saying. I put it also in Light Bearer. That individual will, in himself or herself, exemplify the ideal Ananda devotee. And he said, and from that specific example, many other examples will also exist. But if there wasn't a clearly delineated, recognized example, he said the ideal could become diffused. But in the spirit of Ananda, which is one of its great strengths, is because we're a community and there's so many different devotees, diverse devotees in all stages of involvement, that everyone is free to follow their own sincere inclination and to find those people whose way of expressing or living the teachings genuinely open your heart and genuinely inspire your mind. And one can have multiple mentors in the context of Ananda, so that we don't have to put the burden just on, I am your leader, I am your counselor, I am the one who. It's like we are here all together to find our way. And that's even how Swami describes himself. He says, I've always seen myself as a fellow seeker, blessed in turn when anyone accepts whatever I felt guided to say. So fellow seekers is the way we should all walk together. Now this one is about ongoing to visit and get advice from mediums, those who live in a physical body in this world, but are attuned to individuals in the astral world who don't have bodies and act as a physical mouthpiece for messages that specific individuals, or more than one, want to speak in this world but don't have a body to do it. So, Swami writes, this was in 1976, he wrote this. Thank you for sending me the transcript of that reading. He puts reading in quotes. That's often the word that people use, a psychic reading, an astrological reading, a palm reading. I guess you're reading. Yeah, the idea is that you're seeing it there, that it's not English words, but it's a pattern in your hands, or a pattern in the stars, or a pattern in your aura that somebody with the ability is reading. I never thought about where that word came from, but that's it. I appreciate your letting us know about this material. And then Swami says, frankly, I must say, however, that Master didn't recommend going to mediums, people who speak for people on the other side. In fact, he recommended definitely against it. That's a very frank statement from Swami. It can too often, he said, be a real trap. I urge you not to get involved in such things. For while it is true that good things sometimes do come through such channels, that good is usually mixed up with a great deal that is not valid and not helpful at all. The question remains how to tell the difference. The mere fact of being in the astral world doesn't make souls omniscient. Now this is the funniest part. Now people who are psychic often have expanded intuitive abilities to understand things that do not come just through the rational mind. A medium is a specific way of having access to information that doesn't come through this side. And as I was saying before, this is what he's specifically talking about. I am myself, but I'm also in contact with, and often such a person will have a name. I'm in touch with Ruth or Mary, who is a disincarnate spirit now living in the astral world, and Mary will tell me things that I will say. It's not my perception, it's not my expanded reality. It's she actually talks to me, and because of whatever ability I have, I can hear her. Not really. I'm just saying this is what a medium would say. A psychic can just knows things, and they don't have a contact on the other side. So Swami starts by saying the most obvious thing that needs to be said about people who talk to you from the astral world. They are just people who are dead. That's all. and they're nothing more. They might be more. But just being in the astral world only means that you don't have a physical body. You're not wiser or better or smarter or more good or more holy just for being dead. You're just dead. And the difficulty is when a medium is speaking for a being that doesn't have a body, you have no idea about the character of the source, because the source is beyond your ability to see. And they may have, as some people do from the astral world apparently, you can see and know things in this world that aren't visible with physical eyes, but that really still doesn't make you altogether wise. And this is where Swami said, some good can come of it, because it may be possible, for who knows what reasons, to be able to read signs or transcend time and space, or have some deeper understanding. I'm neither a medium nor am I dead, so I don't actually know what exactly happens. But he said also a great deal that isn't good can come, and it's very hard to tell it apart. You could be getting advice from someone you would never listen to if they were actually sitting in front of you. And you would never trust them. You wouldn't like the sound of their voice. You wouldn't like who they are. You wouldn't like the way their own character unfolds. But you have no idea. So when someone tells you they're getting a message from the other side, this is where Swami says the difficulty is that a great deal that isn't good can be mixed up with it. And also what happens is that sometimes through that channel, or a channel like that, people can read you. They can read your subconscious mind. They can read your desires. They can pick up what you want. And often the reading is a confirmation of what the vibration that's already in you, the desires, the inclinations, the fears, the likes and dislikes. But they're not necessarily picking up what is in your best interest to follow. Because see, that's the difficulty with all of us, is that we have many different voices inside of us. And some of those voices are going to lead us to expanded consciousness, and other of those voices are just going to take us in subconscious circles, or maybe even take us down backwards into things that are no longer good for us. But when we go to a psychic or a medium, and she says, oh, well, you should do this, and yes, that really resonates with me. What part of me does that resonate with? Because a saint or a master sees all levels of us, but will give emphasis to the part that's going to really uplift us. When I first moved to the Palo Alto area, and Ananda had and still has East-West Bookshop, and part of the service that East-West Bookshop is that we do offer the opportunity for people with expanded abilities to meet clients and serve them. And we try to, discern and have only sincere and humble people actually take those roles. And I thought, when I came, I and the manager of the store thought, I'm an experienced counselor, and sometimes people find what I say beneficial, so maybe I should take a slot in the store and also do something. So we put me out as an intuitive counselor. I believe this was my first, and I will also say my last client, although there may have been someone in between that was a little more successful than this. But I sat down, and this woman came in, and she said, "Is Edward the one?" I said, "Edward who? The one what?" I mean, I know perfectly well what she was asking me. I said, "I've never met Edward, and I don't even know who you are. Do you like him? Is he nice? Is he a drug addict? Does he have a job? How does he treat you? And excuse me, but why are you asking me? We've never even met." It was just, I was perhaps a little kinder than that, but not much. And then I said, of course you can have your money back. But it was like, why are you asking me? I mean, seriously, why are you asking me? So we had a conversation for a while about why was she asking me? I mean, why didn't she know her own heart? You know, what was she trying to make happen with this man that she barely knew? Just like all the common sense questions that you would ask. And quite apart from the ability of the psychic person. And believe me, there are many people in the world who are very, very good, who have a very refined nature, a very uplifted spirit, and expanded abilities. I know several, that I can say, I believe if they're not absolutely telling you every detail, the direction of their advice is always upward moving and is always helpful. But there's also the question, and it's a serious one, why am I asking? What is it that I need here? And to whom have I surrendered my power? And do I really know, that this person, I myself personally, although I have friends and I have on occasion, every so often I've had a real dilemma with someone, and I've gone to a particular friend I know and sort of put in front of her, I can't figure out what my relationship here should be. What am I supposed to be doing? Not is Edward the one, but what is my appropriate response? I feel, on the horns of a dilemma about a situation here. What's trying to happen? And I've been helped. But I've been helped the way I would go to any wise friend and ask them to share with me what their insights are. Because very early in my life, like very early, like 1972 perhaps, I was faced with a very complicated personal situation. And I was just visiting a friend. I have besides my sister, my birth sister, I have one friend who is not part of Ananda, but is very sympathetic, and she and I have been spiritual companions for many lifetimes, including this one. I was visiting her back in the early 70s, and there was a psychic reader somewhere, and so because I was facing this huge dilemma, I went in and spoke to the reader. And she told me very specifically that how things were going to work out. And lo and behold, what she told me was just what I wanted. So I listened and I believed her. And for the next many months, and I only realized this after many months had passed, I was not relating to what was going on in front of me. I was relating to her promise about how it would work out. And it didn't work out at all, as she said it would. Not at all. But it took me longer to come to terms with what was happening in my life because of her voice in my mind. And I made a decision at that point, which I have followed pretty steadily, which is I don't ask. Because I don't want someone else's voice in my mind. I'm not that strong. I'm careful. Even when I speak to my intuitive friends who I feel can give me answers beyond reason, I'm very careful, and I listen, and I'm very careful the questions I ask, and I'm very careful about how I receive the answers. And that way, as Swami says, it's true that good things sometimes come, but I don't go to anyone who just tells me they're talking to somebody who's dead. That just makes me very uneasy. And so now there's more to this letter. So after Swami's talked in a general way about mediums and people in the astral world, as for the specific threat of destruction to Ananda, because apparently that's what this reading was about, and what this reading is about, I get, is that California is going to fall into the ocean because there's going to be earthquake and cataclysms, and so maybe Ananda should move into the middle of the country. And that was something that people would tell us periodically, and Swami was always having to deal with. There were spiritual groups in the 70s who did move from California into the middle of the country because they were told California was going to be destroyed and they didn't want to be destroyed. As for the specific threat of destruction to Ananda, I can only say that I truly don't expect it to happen. On the other hand, if it be God's will, then there is nothing we can do to prevent it. We are doing our best to serve God as He wills. The rest is in His hands. But to get some perspective on the matter, it is important to realize that of the predictions made in this manner, the vast majority, have proven false. Swamiji and Jyotish used to always joke. In fact, Swami or Jyotish and or said very proudly that their predictive record was 100%. Every time someone said there was going to be a major earthquake and California was going to fall into the ocean, they both predicted that there would not be one. And as a consequence, they were always right. So far, they had always been right. I'm remembering now that this being dated 1976, this was actually a huge issue all through the 70s. There were people left, right, and center who were telling us that California was history. And what were we doing there? Because we were pretty soon all just going to be swimming with the dolphins, but not in a very happy way. So he said, the vast majority have proven false. Someday, of course, the earthquakes may come. And now Swami refers to Edgar Cayce. He says, but even Edgar Cayce. For those of you who don't know now, somebody actually finally told me. Edgar Cayce, I think, passed away in the late 1940s. I've been trying to guess all this time, and somebody took the trouble to tell me, and now I've forgotten, but I think that's when it was. But Edgar Cayce was a psychic. I don't think he was a medium. I don't think he specifically spoke to other beings, but he went into a trance, and then he would make predictions, and he would read people's energy. But the way Swami says, but even Edgar Cayce, but the interesting thing about Edgar Cayce is that he was an exceedingly saintly person, deeply devoted to God, very austere and very disciplined in the way he approached his life, deeply devoted to Jesus. So when he was speaking, you knew that the channel that was coming to you, I mean, I never met him, of course, but I've read about him a great deal. And his life was exemplary. I mean, he was a very high spiritual soul. So even though he also had these strange abilities, he was he saw way beyond the normal. And then he would also go into these other states of consciousness and hold forth about people's past lives, about the future, about all kinds of conditions. So when we speak of people like this, Edgar Cayce was in a class by himself. His life overlapped with Master's. And I don't actually know if Master ever commented about him. That would actually be interesting. I have this vague feeling that he was written up in East West magazine at some point, but I'm really talking through my hat. So if any of you who are listening to this can inform me more accurately about Edgar Cayce's possible connection to Master or Master's respect for him, I would be very interested to know, and I'll let you all know. But even Edgar Cayce spoke only of changes to the California coastline, not of the whole state being destroyed. And Swami writes, and this was his justification all the time, since California is at this time the most spiritual part of America, it is difficult to imagine that the entire area will be wiped out. And during the years when all this was going on, the 70s and probably into the 80s, Swami's reason for not picking up Ananda lock, stock, and barrel and going somewhere else was twofold. First, when in the late 60s, when he felt guided by Master to find land and start a community, Swami looked all over the country. He even looked in Mexico. I don't think he went farther away than Mexico. Did he actually look in Mexico? I have a feeling that he did, but maybe I'm wrong in that. But he certainly looked all over the United States. I can't imagine now that I think about it that he would have gone out of the U.S. But he looked all over the United States, went to the South and to the Midwest and places where the land was cheaper, and eventually bought land, which is right where Ananda Village is now, near Nevada City. He bought first this more isolated piece of land, 72 acres, and he said as soon as he stepped on the land, he felt that Master had blessed it, that the Masters were already present on that land, and this was the land he was supposed to buy. And it was difficult for him also because Self-Realization Fellowship, he had only been expelled 5 or 6 years earlier. They were strongly opposed to him, and they were not above discouraging anyone who was inclined to go to Swamiji on the basis of him being a disciple of Master. They were not at all shy about saying that he was not a valid disciple. So settling in Northern California, just a stone's throw from where all the SRF centers were, was not convenient for Swamiji. He would have done much better to be in Missouri or Kansas or Connecticut, but instead he was right there. So it wasn't because he wanted it, it was because Master had brought him to that place. He felt that very deeply. So he found it hard to imagine that Master would have led him to a place only to have it destroyed. And then he also used common sense, because the whole of the New Age, so to speak, the whole of Dwapara Yuga has been run to a large extent from the Bay Area, from the San Francisco area, was the heart of this new spiritual consciousness, and subsequently the Bay Area and Silicon Valley have proved to be the cornerstone of the whole technological advance of Dwapara Yuga. Just like all of the most forward-thinking realities were coming right out of this part of California. So again, it just seems unlikely that Divine Mother would plant so much of the important energy going forward in one place and then go, ha, made a mistake, and just throw the whole thing into the ocean. Of course, as Swami said, we're just trying to do her will, and if that's what she does, that's what she does. But merely because some psychic or some medium said it was going to happen, you have to weigh that comment against common sense. So he's kept us in California all this time, and we've continued to develop on the West Coast rather fearlessly. So, and then he uses Edgar Cayce as a counterweight, that yes, things will change, but the whole state won't be wiped away, and Ananda Village at least is inland. We in Palo Alto are more on the coast. We'll see what happens. You know, at the time that the nuclear bombs were dropped on Japanese cities, there were two examples of, one I believe was a convent, one was a monastery, but there were two religious sites. And everything around them was flattened, and their building was not. It's just like there's no logic to it. It's that God will do what he wants to do. I'm going to go in reverse. When Ananda burned in 1976, and almost all the houses at the farm were burned down, 21 out of 22, I think. And a couple of months later, a big oak crashed into one of the houses that didn't burn. We always laughed. It was like Divine Mother said, oops, forgot one, like that, and threw a big tree down on it. It wasn't completely destroyed, but it was certainly injured greatly by the tree falling. But people who were in the house, they had, just before the tree fell, they had just moved far enough away so that when the tree fell, no one was touched by it. Divine Mother's protection. So Swami says, God truly is our only protection in any case. It seems far better to trust in him and to try to follow his guidance, derived through meditation and prayer, rather than to get sidetracked in the questionable truths of astral beings who purportedly speak to us through mediums, because there's also the chance always that someone who says that they're channeling an astral being are just channeling their own subconscious. False visions are very hard to discern. In Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, when he enumerates what are the obstacles to spiritual success, he says false visions. And false visions they're very tricky. I think we all go through them in some lifetime or another, because you can't tell that they're false. Because they are a part of you, but they're not speaking from your rational mind. They're just the result of a vivid imagination. I'm not plagued by false visions or true ones either, so it's not really a problem. But I know how difficult it is, because someone will come to me and they'll be quite certain. And I'm not so certain. But especially if someone becomes identified and invested with their visions. So there's many ways to think about it. For one thing is that a true superconscious vision changes you. I mean, really changes you. It just makes you into someone else. You're never the same before or since. I've had a couple of what I believe are real experiences in my life. One really extraordinary dream even before I came to Ananda. And just to speak of it without sharing it because it's private, but I can see the images in that dream as vividly now as I did then. That was more than 50 years ago. And it also spoke to me in such a way that it directed me properly and gave me peace of mind in ways that worked out exactly as they were supposed to work out. And I've had other dreams in which even Swamiji or someone would come and talk to me, but it was just an image my subconscious was throwing up, putting forward. I mean, of course, the image of Swamiji would appear in my dreams, or Jesus, or Lahiri, or any of the other masters, because I think about them all the time. Just as my subconscious mind also offers me visions of the swimming pool where I go in the afternoons. You know, it's like my subconscious mind is full of things, and if it's going to give me images, I'd much rather it give me divine images. That's just absolutely terrific. I mean, if I'm just going to the grocery store, I'd rather have Jesus as my companion. I mean, like, why not? But every time Jesus goes to the grocery store with me in my sleep, my life isn't totally transformed. So it's a little dicey. A lot of humility is helpful, and a certain detachment, because true visions prove themselves over time, and they don't need us to fight for them. I mean, because everything that you say about true intuition is both sides are always true. So I'm going to direct you to my YouTube channel if you want to sort of look more into that. I'm not an expert on visions, true or false, by any means, but I'm cautious. And as Swami said, truth stands on its own, and you don't have to fight for it. It just makes itself known. And so that's one of the ways that we sort of work with these things. And if God really wants you to do something, He tends to make it clear. He'll keep pushing you until you go there. And Swamiji often, and not only Swamiji, but others that I've known, you'll kind of, if the intuition or the guidance comes to you, sometimes Swami said He'll push it away to see if it'll return. Because, you know, He doesn't want to be tricked. He has a great respect for the likes and dislikes of the heart to influence our thinking and have it masquerade as intuition. So often he'll push the guidance away and see if it keeps coming back, instead of seizing it and holding it with both hands and insisting. But again, both sides are true. Master, of course, who knew what he was doing, sat in the storeroom, had a vision of Americans in the morning, and by the afternoon had resigned his principalship of the school, turned the whole school into other hands, and was making arrangements to come to America. So that also happens. It just, there's no simple answers for this. And then Swami finishes by saying, you seem to have a fairly good understanding of the limits of this kind of experience. I would repeat again, however, that Master recommended that we not get involved in such matters. I like this. You seem to have a fairly good understanding. This is, last week I talked about how carefully Swami expresses himself and how he tries to encourage rather than discourage. But he doesn't say, you have a good understanding, even. He says, you have a fairly good understanding. So he can tell that the person is not entirely gullible, but you can see also that he's not entirely pleased with the person's attitude. Fairly good. What I love, I'm pointing it out because it's true about the way Swami was. I also point it out because oftentimes we are careless with words. And when we're writing letters, we use hyperbole, we flatter people, we just lay it on with a trowel, or we talk and we just gush. But there's we diminish our own magnetism when when we're not exact, when we're not completely truthful in what we say. Completely sincere is almost what I want to mean. You know? It's like, if you say more about someone than you really feel. Now, I know people have different temperaments. And some people just like Well, there's a cartoon that's really funny. It's the Hollywood scene where everybody overdoes it. And so the young writer brings his script in, and the director says, "It's colossal, it's stupendous, it's fantabulous, it's gargantuan." And the writer says, "You don't like it then?" Because everything is always overstated, so words like that don't mean anything anymore. But we don't want to be like that, because we want people to absolutely trust us. We want them to know that when we speak, we mean what we say. Also, that's what gives our words magnetism. It's like when Swami says in the earlier letter, you haven't spoken in such a way as to have the magnetism to attract people to want to listen to you. I have to say, this is a small thing, but I was very pleased. Years ago, I was with relatives, and there was a teenage girl, and she'd had her hair done up in a special way, and she was like 13. And she felt really uncomfortable. She thought it was too much. She didn't want to have to do it like that. And her mother said to me, "Ask Asha. Asha always tells the truth." And I was just like, I was completely outside of Ananda. I was with people that I hardly knew. But I thought, I felt like God was patting me on the head. And so I looked at her hair, and I said to her, "I understand why you feel uncomfortable." And then I talked to her about, from the perspective that you look at it, it looks like this and this, but looking at it as a whole, it actually looks really pretty, like that. But I honored what her mother had said and reassured her, because, a lot of times to a teenage girl, people will just say, "Oh, it looks really nice, don't bother." But you can tell when people are telling you the truth or not. It's very, very important. There's just a whole host of other realities behind telling the truth. That's why it's one of the yamas, is that we refrain from not telling the truth. So be honest, be sincere. That's really the word for it. Be sincere in what you say. Mean what you say. And don't just use words lightly. Now we're coming to another, the best way to change others. And this is from 1989. And Swami writes, Master had a great reverence for life and for all of creation, for he saw all things as expressions of God. He was very mindful of the little details in life and trained us to live simply with divine respect for others. That sentence is, Swami didn't write that perhaps as carefully as he might have, but I was very impressed before I go on with this. Master was very mindful of the little details in life and trained us to live, Swami says, simply with divine respect. But the part of that is, and in Autobiography of a Yogi, I believe, Master talks about how Sri Yukteswar seldom corrected Master in spiritual matters. In spiritual matters, he was pleased with him. But in the way he conducted his life, Sri Yukteswar was often correcting him. And, Master talked about having grown up with servants and just sort of having had his own way. And Sri Yukteswar said, you must learn to behave. And he put a lot of emphasis on the little things that he did. Did you remember to lock the gate? You would think, like, I'm seeking God. What does it matter whether I lock the gate or not? But there's a whole chapter in Autobiography of a Yogi about the cauliflower robbery, where Sri Yukteswar exacts a punishment on Master because Master was careless about locking the gate. So there's a deeper lesson here. Master was very conscious of the little things because our actual consciousness is proved moment by moment. In the big events we can often come through, but who we are is how awake we are on a moment by moment basis. One of the things that I treasured about being in Swami Kriyananda's company was that he operated at such a high vibration and such a high level of energy that just being in his presence, I had to at least strive to meet him. I have tended to be energetic, but I was mentally lazy in a lot of ways. I didn't think clearly. I I didn't apply myself with concentration. I didn't think that clearly about many different things. And, just in his company, you just couldn't get away with it. You couldn't just say some sort of half thought through idea that you just picked up out of a magazine or learned when you were 6 and had never thought about it since then. You could just sort of hand it to him. Or just some sort of sloppy way of doing things. He would always, if it's not done well, you should keep doing it until you do it well. It's like there's no excuse for doing things badly unless you're just deliberately doing them badly. I was speaking in another context about my trailer was a few feet off the ground because it was perpendicular to the hillside, parallel to the hillside. And so I came up to it from a little bit from below, and then it was a big step in. So I decided I would build myself a set of stairs. And carpentry, I don't know how to say exactly that me and hammers and nails have no relationship. But somehow, instead of asking some capable man who would probably have gladly knocked out a couple of stairs for me, I just decided to build it myself. And I did. And it worked. And they were so sturdy, I think the end of the world could come before those stairs were going to fall apart. They're probably gracing the planet somewhere, just still holding together after all these years. But they were just ridiculously made from the point of view of anything that you would call craftsmanship. But I did it. I did it myself. I did it well. I did it as well as I could do it. I put my energy into it completely. Master was very aware of the little things, because why are we being lazy about little things? What makes us... Now, that's quite different than actually putting your energy somewhere else. Like Swami Kriyananda, for example, he talked about when he was living on his own somewhere, and he talked about being enamored with the idea of having flowers, and he went out and he bought a flat of pansies. And then like 3 weeks later, he found them dead on, right outside the door, where he'd just left them the whole time, because he'd been interested in planting the flowers, but as soon as he got them to the house, he started writing a book, and he never thought about the flowers again, because his mind was truly somewhere else. That's quite different when our mind is nowhere. And that's what Master Swamiji, Sri Yukteswar, it's not like you're above paying attention to these little things, you're below paying attention to them. And that's what the masters are pushing us. So he's saying, Master had great reverence for life and all of creation. He saw all things as expressions of God. Every moment is an opportunity to serve him. Master was very mindful of the little details in life and trained us to live simply with divine respect for others. And now we're on the teacher issue again. It is also important, however, not to try to be another person's teacher unless he asks you to accept that role. Swami talked in his advice for marriage, though, he says, marriage is far too close a relationship for one or the other to be the teacher, he said. Even if your partner asks you to be the teacher, he said, treat the request very, very carefully. And so he has this here. It is also important, however, not to try to be another person's teacher. I think what was going on here is that probably someone had written to Swamiji about someone else's behavior, saying, is this right? They're behaving this way. I want to do something about it. Maybe they were complaining about somebody who was close to them. And so that's where Swami says, yes, Master had a certain regard for these things. He paid attention to the little things. He taught us to live simply. He might be confirming that the person's perception and complaint was valid, because Swamiji would often do that. That was one of the ways he would help us. I remember once when I personally was haranguing someone, trying to get them to do something, and they did not appreciate it. And somehow or another, Swami got in the middle of it. And I said, well, don't you think so-and-so would be better off if they actually did this, which I keep trying to tell them they should do? I wasn't quite that sassy about it, but essentially that's what I said. And Swami, the first thing he said to me, oh yes, of course. It would be very good for them to adopt the behavior that you're suggesting. So the first thing he said to me was yes. And the first thing he said to me was, you're not wrong. You're not wrong in your perception. But then he said, but you have to wait until they want to do it, until they're interested in making that change. And so, in other words, I was also totally wrong. Because the question is not, what can I see and analyze and say is true and look how smart I am, but what will help them. And this is, so I think that's what Swami is doing here. That's why these two paragraphs are actually closely related. Yes, in fact, Master would have agreed with you. Yes, in fact, what you're saying is true. It is also important, however, which tells me that he was giving them that, however, not to try to be another person's teacher unless he asks you to accept that role. He doesn't put any caveat, like treated then even very carefully, but he puts it. The best way to change others is through example, which is obvious, and by sincere love. I had an experience in my life. It was personal. I mean, it was me who was struggling. It was very interesting. I was not taking care of business in a way that I should have, because I had a hard time in those years. That was, like in the early 80s. I had a hard time in those years just sort of making the final decision. I could get things sort of set up, but it was partly, I always like to keep my options open. And when I committed myself to something, like I'll be there, and it was setting up lecture tours, that's what it was. So I had to just decide, this is the hall I'm going to rent, this is the topic I'm going to speak on, and on this day I'm going to be there. And it was like 6 weeks or 6 months in advance. And I had a really hard time just closing the door like that and saying I was going to do it. I've since learned to do it effortlessly, but at the time it made me very insecure. So as a result, I would procrastinate and, just not bring things to a focus, not finish. It was also quite simply a lack of concentration. I just couldn't concentrate enough to make the decisions. And so someone tried to help me by explaining to me that I was setting myself up for a disaster and listing to me all the horrible things that were going to happen to me if I didn't just get my act together and get this trip organized. And the more that person talked to me, the more, just completely panicked I got. And finally I was able to get the words out to say, it's not that I don't know that this is a bad idea, it's that I'm scared. I'm just scared. So don't scare me even more. It's not going to make it better for you to make me even more frightened. You should tell me how much I'm loved, and then make me feel safe and loved so that I won't be so afraid, so I can do it. There's a very funny scene in the movie My Cousin Vinny, and the couple in that, Mariessa Torme, I think was her name. I think she got an Oscar. She got a big award for the comedy. The movie is very decades old, but it's really a classic. And so it's this, her fiancé is this New York guy who's an attorney, just newly minted. This is his first case, and she's this real tough lady, New York lady also. So there's some kind of a scene between them where he's trying to get something done and she's ragging on him, trying to get it done better. And finally he just blows up at her. And so she says, "Oh, excuse me, I didn't understand. You want supportive. Okay, honey, I'll be supportive. Wow, you were so terrific. I've never seen anybody as terrific as you." And she just plays this whole sarcastic thing out. It was just, "Oh, forgive me, you want supportive." Well, I mean, that's sort of what I played out. I need supportive. I don't want the truth right now. I just want somebody to tell me it's all going to be okay. And it worked, actually, because that's what I needed. So this is where what Swami says, the best way to change others is through example and by sincere love. And he uses that word sincere, which is what I was talking about earlier when I was talking about what you say to people. It has to be what you really feel. It can't be a technique. It has to be just genuinely. I know, and I've told this story before too, but it's important. A man at Ananda was reading some books about leadership. He was new to his role. And appropriately, he was trying to understand how to be a good leader. And he told Swami that he'd read this, what seemed to him like a good idea, If you have to say something critical to someone, first tell him 2 things that he's done right. And Swami listened, and then he said, then his response was, but that's so manipulative. He said, and anybody who's sensitive will see through it right away. You're just setting them up so that you can cut them down. And it could be done sincerely also. But as a technique, Swami just could not endorse it. So that's why he uses the word, and by sincere love. That we really do love someone, despite the fact that they're full of flaws and they're making a mess of things. But our love for them is completely sincere, and our faith in them is completely sincere. It's not hyperbole to make them feel better. It's like, I really do believe you can do it. And if you can't, I'll stand by you anyway. And that's how you really help people to change. Almost everyone, and this is going back to my own experience, I really learned from that myself. Almost everyone knows exactly what they should do. They're just afraid to do it. And that fear might be they don't know how to put out the energy. They just don't know how to get themselves organized enough to put out the energy, because putting out energy is a very high-level skill that we have to develop. And one of the things that we all learned from Swami at Ananda was how to put out energy. Just more and more and more. Whenever people ask me about what they should do, should they change their job, should they move somewhere else or whatever, I often ask them the question, are you able to give 100% of who you are, where you are now? And if you're not able, is it the fault of the situation, or are you just not doing it? And that's the question. A lot of times, I remember, and somewhere in this book we're going to come to this letter because I know it's in here. Someone wrote to Swamiji, and basically they said, I keep waiting for something to excite me enough for me to really get committed to it. And Swami said, you keep waiting for it to come to you. He said, you have to commit yourself first. You have to give yourself to whatever is in front of you. Then you will develop the magnetism to be able to attract something deeper. But if you're just not putting out energy, waiting for the world to send you. I had this conversation with this woman. She was very upset because she had this certain job that she kept wanting people to give her, and that job, when I finally listened to her closely, was she wanted to be the intuitive leader of the whole project. And it all sounded reasonable to her. She felt she had all these ideas, and I finally said to her, I would never give you that job. I said, you have yet to prove yourself even in the smallest ways. I said, that's a job that somebody gets after they've shown time after time that they have the intuition and the energy to accomplish. Then you get to then you magnetize to yourself that kind of respect. You don't get that kind of respect just by saying, I want it. And, that's sort of what we have. We have to be realistic with people. We have to be sincere with them. I've lost the thread of exactly why I was saying that. But it's... Oh, I was talking about putting out energy. That's what I was saying. You have to really be able to put out energy. And my friend, dear, wonderful friend, whom I adore, doesn't yet know how to concentrate and put out enough energy. And so keeps imagining that if they were given the job they really want, then they would concentrate and put out energy. But it actually works the other way. You concentrate and put out energy, and then you magnetize to yourself greater and greater opportunities. Ananda especially really operates that way. So, the best way to change others is through example and by sincere love. If you can practice simplicity and humility, letting others feel your love for them and your respect, you will have a better chance of helping them to change. Practice simplicity and humility. You'll have a better chance. He doesn't say you'll succeed, but he says you'll have a better chance. Okay. Now this one is, the tagline is Man's Common Destiny. So let's find out what it is. This is January of 1992. This is a person who doesn't live in the community who wrote to Swami as a result of reading one of his books. And Swami starts by saying, I was touched by your sincerity, and I'm glad you found my book helpful. In answer to your question about Buddhism, whereas the truth is ever one, The masters presented at different times and in different places with different emphases, depending on the needs of the people they are teaching. This is just a very interesting little bit about Buddhism, which I'll just read. During the time of Buddha, people had come to an overly personal expectation of being helped by the gods through Vedic ceremonies, known as karmakand. They wanted the gods to do all their work for them, without proper effort on their own part. Therefore it was that Buddha didn't speak of God. He was by no means an atheist, however. The proof that his teachings are true is that those who follow them faithfully eventually discover the same truths that are discovered by the followers of other true spiritual paths. Apparently this man or woman, whoever it was writing to him, was just talking about the fact that people think that Buddha is an atheist. Why do different teachers disagree? And Swami was just giving an answer to that. Disciples have different needs. The ages of the time have different needs. And in this case, Buddha was making a correction. People still think like that somewhat, and that's part of the problem with Hinduism. I know a friend of mine, he was having some difficulties, and so people who loved him in India hired a priest to do all these ceremonies that would sort of help ease his difficulties. I mean, maybe they did. I'm not going to say they didn't. But there's just this sort of, you hire somebody to do a ceremony and then your destiny will change. One of my friends remarked that Hinduism is the only religion in the world that you have to hire someone to practice it for you. And in that case, you hire the pujari, who's the only one who knows the rituals, and he does the proper rituals so that you can conform to your own religious beliefs. I mean, my friend said that he's Hindu, Indian, and he sort of like, there's something not quite right about this. And he was right. And this is what the Buddha was trying to correct. That doesn't mean that mantras and ceremonies don't have power, but you can't just hire a pujari to do something and think that you can be passive in response then. And Buddha was trying to tell people not to be passive, but to be active. So he just took the whole idea of those kinds of, that God is going to do it for you. He just took that off the table because it was such a corrupted idea at that time. He had to correct the corruption before the idea could come back. And then, of course, his followers over time, well, Buddha never talked about God, therefore he was an atheist. And they missed the nuance because Buddha was an avatar. He talked about Sanatana Dharma. And so Satchidanandam, the infinite spirit, is part of all Sanatana Dharma. It's just all, that's why the avatars keep coming back. You asked whether it is truly possible to feel God's grace and guidance in our lives. Absolutely, yes. Many signs of God's love are given to everyone who seeks Him with devotion. In time, moreover, when we have purified our hearts of every desire except the longing for God, He gives us the supreme gift, Himself. This blessed state comes to each soul in time. It is man's common destiny. So that was the answer. Everybody eventually will purge their heart of all desires except for the desire for God, and when that time comes, will realize God. Everyone will have that as their ending. That's an amazing thing to contemplate, because that just means whatever we're doing now and we're not doing it correctly, sooner or later we'll straighten it out. Sooner would be nice, but later's fine, because eventually we will. And that's just what it is. The love you will feel for God is a precious gift. It is the most important ingredient in spiritual progress. You are fortunate indeed, therefore, to possess it. If you haven't felt God's response to your prayers, perhaps it is because you haven't learned yet how to seek Him in quite the right way. For though it is by God's grace that we grow, we need to learn how to cooperate with that grace. So again, here's how Swami writes to people. Love for God is a precious gift. You're very fortunate that you have that. He starts by encouraging him and making him feel that he's very sincere. Swami starts the letter by saying, I was touched by your sincerity. So whatever this person is saying about their devotion to God, Swami believes them and he encourages them. However, if God hasn't really answered your prayers, we have to consider that you still have more to go. Maybe it's because you're not quite seeking him in the right way. And this, what to pray for is a very tricky thing that we have to sort of work with, because oftentimes we ask God for the wrong things, and we ask God to conform to our desires, and there's simply no way he can. It's like trying to coerce your mother into doing something for you that's really unhealthy. I always joke about it. The little child says to Mommy, "I'm going to have chocolate cake for breakfast." Mommy says, "Dear, if you have chocolate cake for breakfast, you won't grow up strong." He says, "Yes, I will." And that's sort of how we pray. Give this to me, Lord, and I know I'll be happy. I saw this, one of those little videos that appears on the internet. And there's a man, and he's got his camera, and it's filming his child. And the child must be about 3 or 4 years old. And it's a little boy, and the entire few minutes that this whole conversation between the father and the son goes on, the child is just boing, 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 just bouncing up and down continuously. Absolutely doesn't stop, with a lot of energy up and down. The father starts talking about this plate of cookies that had been on the table. And how many cookies do you think you ate? And the child says 1. And the father points out that there were 12 cookies on that plate, and now there are no cookies on that plate, and there was nobody else who ate them. So how many cookies do you think you ate? And meanwhile, the child is going boing, boing, boing. Finally the child concedes that maybe he did eat all the cookies. And the father says something like, "I thought that might be true." And you just see this child absolutely insane with the sugar. But it was so adorable in the way it was. And that's what children are. I ate 1 cookie and I'm fine. You say, "Honey, if you eat all those cookies, you're going to be sick, you're going to start crying, you're going to have a meltdown, you're going to have a tantrum." "No, I won't." And so we're not honestly cooperating. We're not cooperating. We think we are, but we're not. Children are being so blatant. We're just as blatant. God finds us just as blatant. Maybe you haven't learned yet how to seek him in quite the right way. Very gentle from Swami. For though it is by God's grace that we grow, we need to learn how to cooperate with that grace. God and the Masters work on us from within. For as Jesus put it, the kingdom of God is within you. So we have to find that feeling of the Guru inside, and then he helps us learn how to love God in the right way. So, the spiritual teachings show us how to cooperate with truth, with others, with God's will. Wherever you are in your own development, I'm sure you would benefit from contact with those who may be further along than you are. Why don't you investigate what Ananda can offer? Since it was to me that you wrote, living here seems like a natural possibility to explore. True teaching is vibrational, much more than factual, and it is generally more easily imparted in person. So again, look how gently Swami encourages him. He doesn't say, "This is your place, you ought to, you'll be stronger if." He says, "In person is a good idea, why don't you think about it?" This is also, see, Swami himself is showing us how to be a true teacher, which is you don't order people about, you don't tell them what they're going to say. Swami had a rule about writing and also about speaking, and it's a really interesting one to contemplate. He taught me this when he was teaching me to write. He said, tell people what the situation is. Give them the facts, tell them the story. But don't tell them how they're supposed to feel about it. Don't tell them that they're supposed to be grateful, that they're supposed to be joyful, that they're supposed to be inspired, that they're supposed to be thrilled. He said, lay it all in front of them and then let them decide. It's very interesting, and I've worked with my own writing because you find out how often that just creeps in. You start piling on the adjectives. And you want to give people the free will to make up their own minds. Because also, if they only take your word for it, it won't even really be theirs. They won't even realize that they've let you tell them, rather than actually experiencing it for themselves. And so this is where Swami just says, since you've written to me, maybe this would help you. You could learn more here, but then he just leaves it. He doesn't say, I expect to hear from you next week. Nor does he, and of course it depends on who it is, but he doesn't put out any exaggerated expectations or promises. Just very neutral. Swamiji, when I watched him over the years, he never used emotion to try to get what he wanted. He never used emotion to motivate people. Now, he used feeling, so I'm making a very strong distinction here. But he never sort of laid out a lot of emotion. You're so wonderful, it's such a wonderful life, you know. You're such a great person, your letter just shines, you know, come here and we'll take care of you and we'll show you. He never created any kind of hoopla. He was very centered and very impersonal. And he would just put it there so that if you felt it, you would come to it, because he just knew on Master's path, on the path of self-realization in the life of Ananda, you have to be strong and you have to really know what you're doing. This is not a place where we can take in people who are not quite clear. I mean, they need to get clarity and then come. I don't mean that everyone has to be a saint. As Swami himself said, they come because they want to be saints, not because they are. But he also, he was very appropriate, is actually the word I'm looking for. He was very appropriate in the way he worked with people. So I'm probably not going to be able to get through this whole letter, but I'll start it anyway. Oh my, this is this really big one. Okay. Oh, it's the last letter in the whole section. It would have been tidy to finish it, but I'm not going to. And this is about, he was asked to clarify the nature of consciousness. So it's not a small potatoes last letter. And this was in 2001. Where does that expression come from? It's not small potatoes. I would say probably an Irishman had that expression. And he didn't want small potatoes, he wanted big potatoes. Isn't it funny how you'll just say something like that? I'll just say it's not small potatoes, then I'll think, who cares whether it's small potatoes? Why does that matter? The more you think about it, the more ridiculous it sounds to you. I was remembering when I was in Italy with Swamiji once, we had met these devotees there. And this one man was quite a character. He was really a character. This was back in like 1981. And Swami said, when I met so-and-so, he said, at first he said, I wasn't sure about him. But over time, you know, he grows on me. And then Swami stopped, because he was also speaking Italian in that context. He said, how could I explain to him that he grows on me is actually a compliment? Because the picture you have, of course, is fungus or something like that you really wouldn't want. And it's an odd expression, no matter how you think about it. But it's sometimes words are amusing, especially when you try to speak to people who don't speak English as a first language, and you have all these colloquialisms. This woman, Bella Potapovskaya, she was from Russia, and she was very good in English, but she learned it after she came to America as an adult. And she was very forceful, and she was saying that she absolutely opposed something, and it was simply not going to happen. If she had anything to do with it, it would only happen through my corpse, she said. I said, through your corpse? What she meant was over my dead body. But through my corpse, how would you not know that it was the same thing? With the image of it, it's always amused me so much. Anyway, so speaking of language, let's go on. So now, chitta is the feeling aspect of consciousness. Swami just starts right in. He was asked to clarify the nature of consciousness. Chitta is the feeling aspect of consciousness. It also underlies all consciousness, inasmuch as consciousness is feeling awareness. Therefore, Master wrote in the chapter on cosmic consciousness in Autobiography of a Yogi, I cognize the center of this empyrean as a point of intuitive perception in my heart. There's another, I'm going to talk for a minute about the word consciousness here, which may be all that we say before we close this class. Someone was asked, someone was asked me once to define the word consciousness, because we use it all the time. And I actually became quite curious about that, because I'd never really considered it. And I wrote to Lakshman, who was Swami Kriyananda's secretary, and as the keeper of the computers and so on, he had access to everything. And I asked him, is there anywhere in any book where Swami actually defines consciousness? Now, maybe there's something, some written material that I don't know about. But Lakshman wrote back to me most interestingly and said that the difficulty with defining consciousness is the foundation of everything. And when you make a definition in relation to something else. A lemon is like an orange, only it's smaller and it's more sour. You know, a mango is similar to a peach, but it's denser and more sweet. You can say it like that. You know, an almond is very smooth, but a walnut is very wrinkled, like that. An Amazon is very tall, but a pygmy is very short. But you have some point of reference. He said, when you start talking about consciousness, there's no way you can define consciousness because there's nothing in relationship to it. Consciousness is everything. And so we use the word, and I realized that awareness, I came up with the word awareness, I came up with the words attitudes, but they're expressions of consciousness. They're not really the thing itself. So it's an interesting way to say it. So he says, Chitta is, and here Swami says, Chitta is the feeling aspect of consciousness. Consciousness is feeling awareness. And this is where we come back to Sat Chit Anandam, ever existing, ever conscious, ever new bliss. And what we're talking, Sat Chit Ananda, we're talking about that consciousness is not, well, that integral to an understanding of divine consciousness is we are not only aware, but there is also a feeling element involved. And so that's what the word chitta means. It's the feeling element of consciousness. It's the bliss element of consciousness. Because you could be conscious, but not have bliss. And this is why Satchidanandam as a definition of God is so important. Because you don't want to be ever existing and ever conscious if the feeling is not good. Because you could be ever existing and ever conscious, and that could be really, really horrible. Or just boring, you know, and just unthinkable. And to a certain extent, one of the things that's happened to Buddhism is because they've taken God out of it, nirvana is nothingness. And as Swami says, it's no surprise that so many Buddhists opt to be bodhisattvas and just keep coming back, because the alternative to that is that they merge into nothingness. And this is a distortion of Buddha's teachings. This is all the distortion that Swami was referring to before, because we become when we become infinite, when we become eternal, we also enter into the feeling of bliss. And that's, of course, why we want it. Just to exist forever might make us not so afraid to die, but it could be really a pretty awful situation. Swami talks about, when people talk about an eternity in heaven, in a body pretty much like this one, living a life that's similar to this, only with no ants and the potato salad at the picnic, you know, without any little annoyances. He said he doesn't sound, that to him doesn't sound like heaven, it sounds like hell. Just to be trapped in this limited condition like this for all eternity, because what does it feel like? It's not merely that it goes on, but what does it feel like? And so chitta is the feeling aspect of consciousness, and because that feeling aspect is bliss, that's what makes it so attractive to us. And Master writes here, and Master in his poem talking about cosmic consciousness, or in his chapter, he's just talking about becoming the whole universe and realizing that his experience of everything, the entire creation, emanated from his own heart. And the heart is the aspect of ourselves, that's our feeling nature, that all of creation is based on my feeling nature of bliss. And that's what we're going to be talking about, but not anymore tonight. We'll talk about it next week. So God bless you, my friends.